What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alrighty, so now we've got Leviticus chapter 2. First chapter was about offerings, especially animal offerings. And now, as you can see from the little section heading here, we're getting into grain offerings. So, not sure there's really much else that needs to be said to get us into this chapter and understanding the context for it. So, Leviticus 2, here we go. When you present grain as an offering to the Lord, the offering must consist of choice flour. You are to pour olive oil on it, sprinkle it with frankincense, and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest will scoop out a handful of the flour moistened with oil, together with all the frankincense, and burn this representative portion on the altar. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering will be given to Aaron and his sons. This offering will be considered a most holy part of the special gifts presented to the Lord. Okay. Maybe that stuff has something to do with the bread of the presence. I keep sitting here thinking about the bread of the presence and what exactly even that is and how it works, what it's made of, and because it still doesn't seem like there was much detail given on that, but whatever. So grain offerings were choice flour, meaning, high quality, I assume, with olive oil, a bit of frankincense. So that was just like a handful of that was supposed to go on the altar. And then the rest of it was saved saved. I don't know if that's quite the right word. The rest of it went to Aaron and his sons. Again, it doesn't really say exactly how with that, or what it was used for, but whatever. If it's a detail we need to know, I'm sure it'll say eventually. So I'm just going to move right along to verse 4. If your offering is a grain offering baked in an oven, it must be made of choice flour, but without any yeast. It may be presented in the form of thin cakes mixed with olive oil, or wafers spread with olive oil. If your grain offering is cooked on a griddle, it must be made of choice flour mixed with olive oil, but without any yeast. Break it in pieces and pour olive oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is prepared in a pan, it must be made of choice flour and olive oil. So the oven and griddle versions specifically mention no yeast, but the pan version doesn't specify that. But all of them involve olive oil. So clearly all grain offerings were supposed to include olive oil. So I guess the olive oil wasn't necessarily directly part of the cooking process, but it was supposed to have olive oil on it. Because, especially the instructions for the griddle version mention breaking it in pieces and pouring olive oil on it. Although it says mixed with olive oil, so I guess maybe for the sake of, cooking it, you got to have that mixture, and maybe then when it's done, they would break it apart and pour olive oil on it. I don't know, but anyway, it makes more sense to me that it would be prepared first and then you would break it into pieces rather than, I guess you could break the lump of flour into individual pieces. I'm trying to think through these things in an attempt to get an understanding of how this works, but I'm also accepting of the fact that maybe I'm not going to be able to get all the pieces to click together in my head 100% of the time. Anyway, moving on to verse 8. No matter how a grain offering for the Lord has been prepared, bring it to the priest, who will present it at the altar. The priest will take a representative portion of the grain offering and burn it on the altar. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering will then be given to Aaron and his sons as their food. This offering will be considered a most holy part of the special gifts represented to the Lord. Sorry, presented to the Lord, not represented. Anyway, so I guess that also kind of explains the first paragraph as well, and the part of the offering going to Aaron and his sons, because it says here that part is their food. So I assume that's a similar case for the first grain offering bit here. So I'm assuming that for this first breakdown, it's saying that like it wouldn't have been cooked yet, because otherwise, like you wouldn't be just scooping out a handful of the flour and oil and whatnot. Anyway, but I guess maybe if they didn't have the frankincense to do it that way, they could cook it and do it with these other methods, because none of these other methods specify frankincense. So, maybe. Anyway. Okay, moving on to verse 11. Do not use yeast in preparing any of the grain offerings you present to the Lord, because no yeast or honey may be burned as a special gift presented to the Lord. You may add yeast and honey to an offering of the first crops of your harvest, but these must never be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Season all your grain offerings with salt to remind you of God's eternal covenant. Never forget to add salt to your grain offerings. Okay, so that's a new step that's been added in, but I assume it applies to all the previous things that were mentioned. Which, salt was a way of helping to keep things fresh for longer. So obviously that would be helpful for the priests if they were keeping that set aside as food. The salt would help preserve that longer. But also, the part with yeast and honey. So it's like, if you're offering the first crops of your harvest, those can be added. But I guess it's not really specifying which type of offering these are for. And, they had different general categories of offerings. Like some were sin offerings, some were just like kind of goodwill offerings, and others were specifically as part of certain, certain occasions, festivals, remembrances, holidays, whatever you want to call them. So maybe these were, at least in this chapter and the one before, maybe these were supposed to be more so for like kind of the goodwill offerings. Because it just says they must never be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So I guess if the offering wasn't going on the altar, then it could include yeast and or honey. And that's kind of the clarification there, because not every offering was burnt on the altar. Anyway. Okay. Moving on to verse 14 and wrapping things up. If you present a grain offering to the Lord from the first portion of your harvest, bring fresh grain that is coarsely ground and roasted on a fire. Put olive oil on this grain offering and sprinkle it with frankincense. The priest will take a representative portion of the grain moistened with oil, together with all the frankincense, and burn it as a special gift presented to the Lord. So, this sounds like they're bringing the grain that was, like, not even particularly mixed with anything. Like, it was just the grain. It wasn't even ground up into flour or anything like that. So, kind of just going over a different occasion and how that could be / maybe should be presented to the Lord as an offering. Because this was a thing that they had to regularly do. They even had a specific festival for the start of the harvest. And that was when they were commanded to bring, the first portion and offer that to God. So, anyway, all that to say, I guess, for this chapter, that there were various possibilities for grain offerings, and, each one had kind of slightly different rules for how it was to be presented as an offering. Okay, so that's Leviticus 2 for you. More rules about offerings and stuff. This time, offerings of the grain variety, more specifically. Anyway, not too much else to say there. So, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video and want others to see. Subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description to get info on other social media pages. And, of course, leave comments down below that with any thoughts you have. Whether it's, related to this chapter specifically, or other Bible stuff, or other video ideas, whatever you have for me. So that's it. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next chapter. But until then, stay cool, people.